Hello, everybody. How are you tonight? Time for another session. Today, we're continuing reading Jane Langton's The Diamond in the Window. And we're on chapter 12, I think. And pardon my wet hair, I just showered. And I'm going to start here in just a minute or two. Uh-oh. If you are on the screen ahead of time, it looks like you have to restart it. But anyway, here we go. Mirror, mirror on the wall. Here you see Edward and Eleanor out in the garden. Little kitty in the background. Edward's looking into the gazing ball. And that's where we start. Mirror, mirror on the wall. Edward stood spread-legged, his empty lunchbox in one hand, an after-school licorice stick dangling from his mouth, and peered into the perfect silver surface of the gazing globe in their front yard. With his nose next to it, his reflection looked like some strange kind of creature with a giant proboscis and a small pinhead. His hands, sticky from the licorice, made black smudges on the ball. The huge wooden house behind him was reflected in miniature, its walls bulging with the curve, its towers shrinking backward. It had occurred to Edward that the gazing globe might be the mirror mentioned in the mystic verse, "O crystal ball," he said, "what do my tomorrows hold?" The gazing globe was silent. No miraculous picture bloomed up in the reflection. Edward asked it where the treasure was, and Ned and Nora and Prince Krishna. Nothing happened. Then he asked it if Edward Hall would ever be President of the United States. "Tell me, O crystal ball," he said. Just for a moment he thought something was happening in the gazing globe. A small, spidery form detached itself from the background and became larger and larger. Suddenly, it was his sister's speckled face, looking enormously back at him. Edward crossed his eyes at her and stuck out his tongue, which was a horrible black from the licorice. "Look out," said Eleanor cheerfully. "Your face might just freeze that way." Then she gave a little cry. "Oh, look at my nose!" "It isn't really that big," said Edward. "I know, but my freckles! I've got more." Eleanor covered her nose with her hand, aghast. "Please, oh please, crystal ball," she said. "Tell me it isn't true." She made mystic motions with her hands over the ball. Then she jumped. Something had suddenly started up in the reflection and nearly filled it. A monstrous head with ginger hair. It was Uncle Freddy. "Oh, Uncle Freddy," said Eleanor, "just look at my new freckles. I've got more, haven't I? Be honest. I do, don't I?" She stood up and looked at him, her forehead wrinkled, her new-found freckles displayed with a shining frankness in the Indian summer sunshine. Uncle Freddy looked down at her and smiled. "My little tiger lily," he said. "Faces of children are like flowers, a bit of natural beauty." He chucked Eleanor fondly under the chin, and then his expression changed. "But faces of grown-ups are man-made. There's never an instant's truth between virtue and vice. There's never an instant's truce between virtue and vice. Beware how you paint yourself." "Paint?" said Eleanor, thinking hopefully of powder and rouge. "Do you think paint would cover them up?" "No, no," said Uncle Fredly, turning vaguely away. "I mean what Henry said, that we are all sculptors and painters, and our material is our own flesh and blood and bones." He turned back and shook his finger at her. "So carve yourself well." Then he stooped and looked at his own odd face in the gazing globe. There, of course, it looked odder still. Ah, well, he said, and all at once there were tears in his eyes. It's what we could have been that breaks the heart. There is no limit to our capacity. He flung out his arms in a grand, generous gesture and shouted a glorious question of his friend Waldo's. Who can set the bounds to the possibilities of a man? Eleanor and Edward listened respectfully. Were they supposed to answer? But Uncle Freddy dropped his arms, rubbed his sleeve over his eyes, and went away. He was mumbling a phrase over and over. Private infinitude, private infinitude. Aunt Lily, who was sandwiching fall house cleaning in between her piano pupils, stood on the porch with her sleeves rolled up, energetically shaking out a dust mop. Something Uncle Freddy had said reminded her of her favorite hymn by James Russell Lowell, and now she brandished her dust mop in time and started to sing it in strong, clear contralto. Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide in the strife of truth and falsehood for the good or evil side. The hymn had a threatening gloom that she loved. Dust kitties flew rhythmically out from the sprawling forsythia bushes, and Aunt Lily sang on as direfully as she could the solemn last words of the first verse. And the choice goes by forever twixt that darkness and that light. Put down your mop, Aunt Lily, said Edward. Here comes a broom. It was a broom. Mary Jane Broom, marching up the walk, all ready to torture her teacher with a new lesson. Perfect note for note, hideous in tone. Aunt Lily sighed, put down her mop, and assumed her pleasant teacher manner. Eleanor started at Mary Jane. She was Miss Prawn's niece, and her complexion was white and pink as a good little girl's could be. Eleanor felt rebellious. All the rest of the day she kept running her fingers over the bridge of her nose. She couldn't feel her freckles, but she knew that they were there. She was still worrying about them as she lay in bed. The light was out, and Edward had already gone to sleep. Eleanor hunched herself up under the covers and sat with her long red hair streaming over her knees, staring across the room in the mirror that rose up in the gigantic old dresser. She could just see herself, a silhouette humped up in bed. She asked the mirror a question. Mirror, mirror on the wall, what's to become of Eleanor Hall? Who would ever marry anybody who was skinny, wore glasses, and had freckles all over her face? Certainly not Benjamin Parks. Eleanor would have to be an old maid, like Aunt Lily, and give piano lessons. Or maybe she would be a nurse or a teacher. Who or what she was to be, pardon me, who or what was she to be one day? Eleanor felt sorry for her pitiful self, and a tear fell on her pillow. She went to sleep at last, but not until she had made up her mind about something. Tomorrow morning she was going to borrow some of the face powder on Aunt Lily's dressing table and cover her freckles with it. Aunt Lily didn't use it herself, and she'd never miss it. Then, as Eleanor and Edward slept, the full October moon rose clear and sailed up into the sky. Its light passed through the stone of the middle of the window and traveled across the room to the great dark world of the mirror. From there, it was reflected back to the window again to hit squarely one sloping triangular facet of the stone and to be returned at a minute angle. From the mirror once more it made a journey at the speed of light to another facet of the stone, a long rectangular cleavage that instantly turned it back upon itself. Over and over again the reflecting surfaces of the stone returned the light to the mirror. Over and over again the mirror sent its rays back until infinity folded upon infinity, the reflections were becoming beyond counting. The gift of the mirror. Here's the picture. They were very small. They were walking across a marble plain. It was the dresser top. Ned and Nora were walking ahead of them, not far away. It was dark, but Eleanor could see them dimly, and she could hear them talking. Ned had his arm up now, pointing at something. Catch them, said Edward. They started to run. Then Ned and Nora were gone. Eleanor stopped. Where were they? Eddie looked up at the big mirror frame. Had they climbed up to the shelves? If only he had brought a rope and some climbing spikes. Trebor Nosenibor would never be without a rope. He would carry one, always, attached to his belt, right next to his beautiful jackknife, with its 6 or 7 different blades. Edward stood beside the mirror frame and felt idly around it for handholds. Eleanor had no intention of climbing anything. She was fascinated instead by the dark vastness of the mirror. What would a tiny creature like herself look like in so monstrous a field of glass? She walked slowly towards it. The mirror was completely dark. Then, all at once, she blundered into the path of the moonlight, and it poured back and forth upon itself from the window. The whole great length of the window was suddenly flooded with light. "Eddie! Eddie!" shrieked Eleanor. "Look! Look!" By dint of some shifting back and forth, Eddie managed to stand in the same relation to the light path. Together they looked at their reflections in the mirror. It was like a mirror he had seen once, Eddie decided, a double mirror that had reflected him over and on in a dim infinity. Here he was again, 1,000 times over, 1,000,000 times over, 1,000,000 times. The mirror was much clearer. This mirror was much clearer than the others. All the Edwards were sharp and crystalline, the 1,000th one as clear as the first. Only a little rainbow colored from the multiplicity of the reflection. If he lifted his right hand, half of the Edwards lifted their right hands, and the rest lifted their left. He danced a jig. The 1,000,000 Edwards danced too. And Eleanor saw the same. Eleanor, over and over again, each strand of her hair, each freckle, infinitely and perfectly repeated. The reflections were so perfect that it was almost as though there were no hard dividing glass in front of them at all. She walked forward and reached out her hand to touch it. It should be about here, but it was not. She crept forward again, pushing her feet ahead of her carefully, expecting to be brought up against an invisible wall. It must be right about here somewhere. She couldn't have passed it. Eleanor looked back. Why, there was the crack in the marble that meant the end of the real dresser top and the beginning of the reflected one. And it was behind her. She whirled around. Where was Eddie? He had gone through too. Eleanor turned again and felt with her hands at the place where the back surface of the mirror should have been. It was all soft black, impalpable air, the enormous frame rising up on either side and melting with the blackness of the night. Doubtfully, she looked again into the depths of the mirror world. Before them stretched the 1,000,000 Eleanors, the 1,000,000 Edwards, sparkling, brilliant, each in a glassy shaft of reflected light. The real Eleanor, the real Eleanor leaned over to her brother. The millions of reflected Eleanors leaned over too. The real Eleanor whispered in the real Edward's ear. Ned and Nora must have come into the mirror. The millions of reflected Eleanors whispered, and the sound of their whispering was like a great shooing. Eleanor straightened up. So did all the others. The whispering sound gradually became fainter and finally stopped. It's just an echo, decided Edward. They didn't really say anything. Come on, said Eleanor. Let's see if we can find Ned and Nora. They walked forward. It was like walking into a maze of mirrors. If you walked fearlessly straight ahead, you found yourself within the next mirror and approaching 2 others. You could choose either one and then go through that one to 2 more. Choose one of those and find 2 more. It was as though they stood at this moment of the apex of an infinite choice. It was as though they stood at this moment at the apex of an infinite choice. But once they chose, they would have to stick to that part of the maze, and the further they went in, the harder it would be to go back. Which way had Ned and Nora gone? Edward studied the first two reflected Edwards. Were they exactly alike, or was there something a little different in the expression of the left-handed one? Something ever so slightly disagreeable about the curve of the mouth. "That's the way you look when you're being stubborn," said Eleanor, chuckling and pointing to it. There were two Eleanors, too, to choose between. One of them stood beside the slightly stubborn-looking Edward. That one looked a little paler than the other. Why? Eleanor remembered that she had decided to powder her freckles. Now she could see a distant chalky blotch on her nose. Distinct chalky blotch on her nose. She looked at the other one. It had the usual complement of freckles, the same ordinary Eleanor look. Eleanor prodded Edward. "Let's try that one," she said, grabbing his hand. She pulled him into the left-hand mirror, the one with the stubborn-looking Edward and the pale-looking Eleanor. "No," said Edward, "wait." But it was too late. They were inside. "I thought I caught a glimpse of Ned and Nora just then." "In the other mirror," he said crossly. "You did?" said Eleanor. She felt a little uneasy. She, too, had caught a glimpse of something as she passed through the mirror threshold. But it was within this mirror that she had seen it. Just a momentary flash, a glimpse of a face grinning at her and beckoning. Was she foolish to think she had seen it, or was it really the Jack-in-the-Box? "Look," said Edward. "They're stiff now, like statues." Their images were still there. They hadn't disappeared when Eleanor and Eddie stepped across the mirror sill, but they no longer imitated them. They just stood motionless. They were absolutely perfect copies of real Eleanor and the real Edward. Nose for nose, ear for ear, eyelash for eyelash, cowlick for cowlick. Edward's reflection was like Edward, and there was just the merest hint of a stubborn look about the mouth. Edward stood in front of it and made the same look with his own. "You're frozen that way now," said Eleanor. Shyly then she looked at her own image and reached out a hand to touch its face. It was soft and warm as her real face. She patted the powder on its nose, then smoothed it to either side a little, to blend it in. As she did so, some of the freckles underneath began to show through again. "Oh dear," said Eleanor. "I wish I had a little more powder." She looked around. There was no powder to be had. But there was another pair of Edward and Eleanors. She looked quickly at the two new Eleanors. One of them had a shiny, washed-looking nose, but the other looked as though she had found the powder box, and there was a little wrinkle between the eyebrows of this Eleanor that looked rather, what? Discontented? Worldly-wise? Without even looking at the two Edwards, Eleanor dragged her brother after her into the side of the mirror where the freckleless Eleanor stood. Edward protested. They began to argue. The argument The argument became a scuffle, then a fight. They began yanking and dragging and tugging one another into new openings of the mirror maze. Sometimes Edward won, sometimes Eleanor. They stopped looking at the images and just lurched and shoved each other among them. Then, all at once, Edward stopped fighting and looked at the frozen statue of himself into which he had tumbled. Like all the rest, it was brightly lit. He was looking at the back of it. There was something odd about the neck. Eleanor stared at it too. Slowly, they walked around to the front and looked at it in horror. It was old Edward, all right, but an older Edward, a middle-aged Edward, a dreadful Edward. The stubborn expression that had been boyish and soft about the mouth of the first Edward was cast now into a grim tightness, a rock-hard bluish line. The eyes were shadowed and dark and lifeless. The whole face was seamed with ruthless, ugly lines. "I don't like it," cried Edward. He touched it. It was as warm and as real as the first. Then he gave his sister a frightened glance, and together they turned to look at the Eleanor that had matched this version of Edward. Eleanor took one look and covered her mouth with her hands. Her image was worse than Edward's. Worse! "Oh, no! No!" screamed Eleanor, and turned to escape. Choose, she said. "Oh, let's be careful how we choose." Together, they stared at the next pair of images. But there was no choice. There was only one more set, one Edward and one Eleanor, a frightening, savage Edward and a terrible, tawdry Eleanor. They turned this way and that, looking for the other pair of images. But there were no more. They had come so far in the wrong direction that they could no longer choose at all. They could only go one way. Their choices had shriveled down to one alone, and that was no better than none at all. Or could they go back? They hadn't tried that yet, and when they did, the lights went out. All was in blackness. They groped behind them in the dark. Would the mirrors be frozen up behind them, walling them in? That wouldn't be fair. After all, it was only a dream, only a kind of game. They hadn't really lived this awful life yet and made themselves into those dreadful creatures. Made themselves. That was what Uncle Freddie had said, thought Eleanor. Beware how you paint yourself. Carve yourself well. She collided painfully with Edward. Then they held hands and struggled on in the total darkness. For what seemed like hours, they battled their way backwards through the maze, feeling for the path by which they had come. They were continually running up against mirror walls and striking against their other images. Sometimes they took wrong turnings altogether and wandered so off the main track that they almost gave hope of ever finding it again. At last, one of the images, after giving Edward a dreadful crack across the shoulder when he blundered into it, proved to be one that he remembered. It was one of the smaller ones, and he had been hit by the baseball bat in its hands. Eddie reached up and felt for the top of its head. It's only about a half-inch taller than me, he said. There began to be a little light. At first it was more confusing than helpful, feebly reflected by the complexity of mirrored surfaces. But soon they were able to interpret true image from false and find their way with only an occasional wrong turning. At last Eleanor recognized the back of the first of the reflected Eleanors, the one with the faint dusting of powder on its nose. Hateful girl, she said. Then she stood outside the mirror maze, looking back at it. Again, in all the multitudinous images were Again, all the multitudinous images were visible in bright light. Again, they could look at the original pairs. Should they choose once more? You said Ned and Nora went that way? Said Eleanor, pointing at the mirror image of Edward that looked bland and friendly in the usual way. Yes, said Edward. They stepped through the mirror into the right-hand side, and then they stepped through into the next. The choosing was easy when they looked a little carefully. The statue-like images were getting taller. Eleanor decided to concentrate on the reflections of Edward. There was no denying that they were getting very good-looking. One of Edward's they chose had a gay red mustache and chin whiskers that made them laugh. But the next Edward seemed to have shaved them off. After a while, the real Eleanor and the real Edward became quite shy. Their elder selves overawed them. Edward grew as tall as Eleanor's and then taller. His plumpness was gone. He had grown to a strong, stocky middle height. Eleanor's images grew willowy and slender. They stopped for a moment and walked around their images, not saying anything. I don't suppose we'll ever be as nice as that, faltered Eleanor. No, said Edward. You've still got freckles, I see, though, he said. There were freckles there, all right. Hardly faded at all. Eleanor could see that they didn't matter. I like them, she said stoutly. Now what? Said Edward, turning to the mirror maze again. Look what's happened, said Eleanor. Instead of two choices, there were many. They were unable to choose which was best, so they picked one at random, and beyond that choice lay 100, and beyond the next 1,000, just as the other maze had led them down a narrowing path until there was no choice left. This one opened out into wide and shining worlds of possibility. Eleanor and Edward wandered up and down, looking at the images of themselves, overwhelmed by what they saw. The images carried objects or were doing things so that they could tell what their occupations were. One of Eleanor's was an artist, another was a teacher, another was a poet, another a lady doctor, another was a mother with children. Edward's were all sorts of things, too. There were scientists of various kinds and uh, it appears to be stuck. Hold on. That or it's a misprint. Oh, no, my bad. Thought it was the next chapter. There were scientists of various kinds, and a mathematician, and a writer of books, and a professor, and a lawyer. Edward looked at all of these and stopped suddenly in front of the next. Here's a picture of them. Edward in a hunting explorer's outfit, and Eleanor in a jaunty dress and This one was very dashing. It was dressed in a kind of romantic swashbuckling way, with a high leather boots and short trousers and a pith helmet. There were all sorts of useful tools hanging on its belt, including a complicated jackknife that simply sprouted blades. Edward could see all the blades quite clearly. There were 3 ordinary life blades, a screwdriver blade, a can opener, a leather punch, and a corkscrew. There was even an infinitesimal pair of scissors. What a magnificent tool! Who or what this image was supposed to be? Who or what was this image supposed to be? Then Edward spotted the coil of rope dangling neatly from its belt, and he knew it was none other than Trevor Nosnibor. And next to Trevor was another odd one. Edward couldn't make it out. It was sitting at a big desk, studying a pile of papers. Edward stooped over and looked up at the face. There was something about it he liked, but what? The red hair was receding a little bit from its brow, and the eyes concentrating on the papers before them. And the eyes concentrating on the papers before them had a determined, courageous look. Edward stood up again. He didn't know which of them all to choose. Eleanor didn't have to think. She liked all of the reflections of herself, but she chose the one that had the children. Edward lingered in front of Trevor Nosnibor, looking at his gorgeous jackknife and the sturdy coil of rope. Trevor was wonderful and inviting, but Edward found himself turning away from him to walk through the mirror towards the Edward who was sitting so quietly at the big desk. There was something about this one that attracted him, something that seemed more daring and brave, even than Trevor himself. "Oh, Edward," whispered Eleanor in awe. "Look at you." His new image was the President of the United States. Truly! Edward looked at it and felt himself turning scarlet. "Well, look at you, too," he said. Like his own, Eleanor's image was older, but it was very beautiful. There were graying streaks in her hair, and she was surrounded by grown sons and daughters, and her face had a combination of freckles and wrinkles, so wonderful and radiant and shining that she was handsomer even than her own handsome children. Surprisingly, she looked very much like Aunt Lily. "And look at the mirrors opening out from here," said Eleanor. From each one of the sons and daughters, a new mirror maze opened out, and they could see that each of these children would walk naturally and easily along the right side of the maze, each one drawing out of his own private infinitude the correct thread through the labyrinth, painting and carving himself with sure hands. But out from the new Edward there opened a range of possibilities, of a more awful kind. His were not personal possibilities, but possibilities for the world. Some were very bright, and some were very dark indeed. Edward couldn't bear it any more. He looked down at the small length of himself, with his short legs and the dirt under his fingernails. Let's not look any more," he said. But before they turned to go, one of the images spoke to them. It was Trevor. He called to Edward, and his voice had a kind of echo in it, as though he were calling from far away, all down the corridors of years of time they had passed through. "Edward," he said. Edward looked up at his rejected image, feeling a little guilty. Trevor was smiling sadly at him. Then Trevor reached down and unfastened something from his belt. He reached his hand far, far out across the intervening space towards Eddie. Eddie reached out too. His finger tips touched those of the image and took the object from them. He looked down at it. It was the jackknife. "I don't need it any more," said Trevor Nosnibor in the faraway, echoing voice. Edward, overcome by feelings he could not express, looked up to say thank you, but the image of Trevor was retreating. All the images in the mirror maze were rushing away from them, sweeping back into the time from which they had come. And Eleanor and Edward were being swept back too. Back they went, out of the mirror and out of sleep. Back into the beds in the tower room of the house on Walden Street, to wake up in the present and the ordinary October morning, and sit up and look at each other. Edward saw a red-headed girl with tangled hair groping for her glasses, her snub childish nose generously freckled. Eleanor saw a boy in rumpled pajamas, a boy so short that his legs still came only halfway down the bed. Then they looked at the big mirror across the way. It was the same as it had always been. A single sheet of glass innocently reflecting their two heads, and the window, and the diamond, and the yellow tops on the elm trees out of doors. Edward looked down at his hands. They were folded together, clenched over something. Slowly he opened them, and there was the gift of the mirror. Trevor's knife was really there. Edward was delighted with it. The gift might not be worth a king's ransom or a barrel of tax money, but it was a treasure that went to his heart. He would not let himself think about that other Edward, the August Edward behind the desk in the dream. The August Edward behind the desk in the dream. That was too great a weight to carry in his head. Instead, he could play at being Trevor Nosnibor for a long time yet. Happily, Eddie pulled the blades in and out, examining them. Had Ned, too, received a gift from the mirror? Could have been as fine as this one is? Eleanor didn't mind either that the dream had produced no jewels. She padded across the floor to the dresser and leaned on its marble top. Critically, she examined her freckles in the mirror. Then she smiled. They weren't so bad, after all. It wasn't worth going to the trouble of stealing Aunt Lily's powder. Let her freckles go. And that's the end of the chapter. The next chapter is called The Star in the East. But I want to address something in this last chapter. I'm not sure when this was written. Let's see if it was... Text was copyrighted in 1962. It was an older time. Things were a little bit different. The choices that were presented to Edward and Eleanor, in my opinion, were very outdated. Today, it's just as easy to see either of them choosing to go into either of the professions. Eddie could become a teacher, a doctor, a nurse, and Eleanor could become a president, a scientist, an explorer, anything she wants. And remember that you can be anything you want. You just have to make the choice. Look into the infinity of yourself and choose wisely. So with that, I'm going to wish you a good night, and we'll see you next time. Remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you again.